99% of successful businesses are examples of successful businesses without strategies. There is a very simple way to win without a strategy, which everyone understands and everyone is doing, and it's totally fine and legitimate, which is simply effort.
Pretty much every business has goals and makes plans. But when everything else is equal, having an actual strategy is what separates the winners from the rest.
Every strategy worth its salt boils down to finding a point of disagreement with the category you're in.
The strategy world wants you to think it's only for the experts, or that it's too complicated for people to understand. But according to professional strategist Alex Smith, strategy is an amateur sport.
The beauty of being a person who gets a bit like, oh, you're telling me too much, is that person will naturally then say, just give me the gist, right? The second that you say, just give me the gist, bam, you're in strategy land.
Alex and I discuss some of the best strategies out there, from companies like Southwest, Nintendo, grenade bars, and 4-hour energy drinks.
This is the best strategy of all time.
4-hour energy.
This is the best strategy of all time.
That is excellent.
And the one thing they all have in common: simplicity.
So there's a little sort of model that you can remember very easily. Okay, better equals shit strategy. Different equals okay strategy. Whereas contrarian equals great strategy.
Getting straight into it, Alex, is strategy underrated or overrated?
Well, I love that question because mostly I would say overrated, because 99% of things that you're going to see out there that are labeled as strategy are useless. And I think that people intuitively understand that. I mean, I think that it's funny because it's something where everybody understands in the abstract. They say, oh, well, strategy is this big, important thing. But then that begs the question, how many actual specific strategies have you ever come across that you found super useful, or that really kind of, delivered exponential results like what they're meant to? For most people, the answer is zero. And actually, I think a lot of the time, depending on the field, strategy is actually something that gets in the way of doing the real business, so to speak, rather than being an enabler, which it should be. So for the most part, I think it's sort of overrated, and there's a reason why people kind of roll their eyes at it. But obviously, in theory, a good strategy, that's going to 30x your results just by a little bit of good thinking that could have taken you 10 minutes. So when you look at it that way, it's very underrated.
How can you get to a good strategy in under 30 minutes? That sounds more like a soundbite than a reality.
Oh, I mean, well, when you think about it, like any strategy, ultimately, I mean, we can talk about, the sort of like the structure, the content of a good strategy, but just speaking more generally, all any strategy is going to be, when it comes down to it, is a realization of, oh, what if we did X? Would that work? Now that X, you could have come up with that in any moment. You could have come up with that in 6 minutes or 6 months. Of course, in principle, the longer you take over it and the more thorough you are, the more likely it is to be good. But at the same time, the quality of a 6-minute strategy is perfectly possible to be better than a 6-month strategy, provided that, you're lucky, or you are working with huge amounts of skill or pre-existing knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. Okay,
before we go into a rabbit hole, what is strategy? How do you define it?
So most people understand strategy by, let's say, the dictionary definition of the term, which is always something like a plan to achieve a certain goal. And I think this is where things all sort of immediately collapse. Because when you think about it, that word, the general word, that's got to apply to a strategy for having a happy marriage or getting 6-pack abs or whatever. You could have a strategy for anything. And so obviously there is no kind of narrow definition of what that's going to look like.
Well, that's good to know 2 of your strategies.
Oh, I mean, those, if you want those ones, I'll tell them to you afterwards.
Thanks.
And, but if we think about like a specific domain like business, when I say to you, oh, well, all it is a plan to achieve a goal. I mean, that's like, how useless is that? That's essentially like I'm just saying to you, oh, well, all you have to do is come up with a great idea. Off you go. So you know less than when you started, almost. But if you actually narrow the definition a bit so that it's specific to business, then it starts to become a lot clearer and make a lot more sense. So if we ask, what is a business strategy, what does a business strategy look like? And there are exceptions, but 95 times out of 100, what it's going to be is essentially answering this riddle. How can we sell something, number one, that people want, but number two, they can't get anywhere else? Those two halves of the equation. And when you look out there at like most businesses, every business has nailed one of them. They're either selling something people demonstrably want, like we sell socks, people need socks, we've ticked that box. Or maybe they're selling something very unique that people can't get elsewhere, like we're selling vegan dog food or something like quite random and specific. But it's very, very unusual to manage to do both of those things at the same time. And you can sort of understand that if you manage to simultaneously give people something that they're looking for, but that they have no other options of which to get it, well, that's basically a license to print money. And that is ultimately the game of business. So therefore, if you want to build a effective business, if you answer that question, if you come up with a hypothesis to do that thing and you successfully do it, then off you go. And that's going to be a successful strategy. So you can kind of boil it down to just the term unique value. What is the unique value that your organization and only your organization brings to the market?
Another one of our guests, Alice Benting, says that they're looking for the secret. And it sounds very similar. You know, they design companies, they design essentially tech unicorns by sticking founders together who've never met each other and telling them to come up with an idea over a process. And the job is to find a secret.
I love that. It's funny that you say that because that's from one little sort of exercise I think is really useful is to think of words that basically mean strategy, but that are more useful than strategy. And one of the ones I always talk about is secret. It absolutely is that. When you've figured out a secret, something that the rest of the market doesn't know, and it's something hiding in plain sight. Once you say it, it's obvious, but people just haven't been executing on it. Then boom, that's competitive leverage. And what is strategy? Strategy is competitive leverage. So yeah, it is just that easy in principle. But of course, to see something that's hiding in plain sight is actually technically very difficult.
So you say on LinkedIn, which is obviously where I contacted you because I get a lot of your content around strategy and I think it's really insightful. Strategy is an amateur sport. What do you mean by that?
Well, let's look at it this way. Like there are obviously people out there who have the term strategist in their job title. And then you can hire, I don't know, McKinsey or whatever to sort of do strategy. And you could also like get an MBA or some sort of like qualifications in strategy. But the people doing that stuff, they account for a tiny, tiny fraction, if any, of the really big strategic breakthroughs that happen. Because ultimately, if you just think of it as just a leader, someone with responsibility who's deciding what to do, coming up with a really exciting theory off the back of a secret, that process is largely being done by people who are not qualified strategists. And even if you look at, so who's the best sort of most famous strategist sort of ever colloquially is probably like Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was an amateur strategist. You know, as far as I'm aware, he had absolutely no qualification, but that wasn't a blocker to him just having bloody interesting insight and then the courage to follow through. And every founder, every CEO, their job is to have an interesting insight and then have the courage to follow it through. So yes, can you outsource it to someone who's got like a bunch of like SWOT charts or something and who is going to do it in a technical way? Yes. And maybe in some cases that would be a smart thing to do. But ultimately, if you always just bring it back to it just being the truth of the matter is, I've got an interesting theory. We're going to take a punt on this. And if it works, we're all going to be rich. Well, that's everyone, isn't it? Or at least it's everyone in a decision-making responsibility.
What's your view on professional strategists like McKinsey?
Well, I mean, I'm a professional strategist, so obviously they're fantastic.
But you seem to me like an amateur strategist, mate.
How
could you be a serious strategist if you doesn't say you work at McKinsey?
I mean, that is something that I've often grappled with.
Yeah.
I think that what I'm not a fan of is systematized strategy. Now,
what does that mean? Does that mean like one size fits all kind of strategy?
I mean, you have a sort of formula or proprietary process where you say, okay, follow these steps in a workshop or whatever, and this is going to spit out a strategy.
Got it.
I think to be a professional strategist, you have to also be able to embrace the chaos and randomness and ultimately sort of opinionated nature of the discipline. And that becomes a very difficult thing to sell because, of course, like, you know, I wouldn't put it this bluntly, but if you're basically rolling into a business and saying, well, ultimately what I'm going to tell you, it's just going to be what I reckon, you know, it's just going to be my educated opinion, but an opinion nonetheless, which I think is true. And it's the only true way that you can approach it. It's the only intellectually honest way you can approach it. It's quite hard to then tie that back to, and the fee will be £1 million, because people want to see science. They want to see rigor. They want to see process. And of course you can do all of that stuff, but I think it's a little bit emperor's new clothes. There does come a point when you just have to sort of let that go and make a courageous decision.
So if you're a founder, is there not an aspect to the way that you're describing how strategy could go, you know, scientific process, et cetera, that sort of flies in the face of testing and failing and having an MVP out there and seeing what you learn and just getting on with it?
I certainly agree that the basic pattern of strategy development is exactly what you say, which is essentially you have your starting hypothesis. You've got to begin with some sort of idea. Maybe it's just a product idea, whatever. You put it out there in the market. You sort of throw shit at the wall. You see what sticks. Over time, you start to learn, what is this thing we have created? What is this thing we have on our hands here? You are humble enough to recognize the answer is it's not going to be the thing that you originally were trying to make. It's going to be something different. It's going to be something better. Then you as the founder, you have to kind of like discover what that thing is, because it's kind of like, you know, water finding the fastest way downhill. By the same token, a business is going to find the sort of lowest friction way through the market. So the business, unless it's just a complete flop, it's going to kind of pull you in the strategically high leverage direction if you're sort of sensitive enough to watch that unfolding. And then once you figure that out, boom, off you go, you can push it. Or like as Dolly Parton says, find out who you are and do it on purpose. That's the game. So that is definitely, I would say, the recommended process. But most businesses, they never do the second part. You can grow a very big, successful business 100% by throwing shit at the wall, 100% experimentally. So you might never mature in that sense.
Okay. It also sounds to me like there's a lot of listening and awareness required to sort of delve into a good strategy, right? So just because you've defined it, it could still be quite broad, right? A strategy could sort of look a little bit like that, like a bit of a funnel anyway, and there's different strands within it, and you've got to listen to what the market is telling you to see if the strategy is even correct. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, you know, once you execute sufficiently deliberately and purposefully, almost immediately, you're going to get positive or negative feedback. And to be honest, if your strategy is really specific and directional and you genuinely execute on it, if you don't see an immediate, then already I think you've probably failed, because it should be that obvious. The feedback loop should be that obvious. You should really be able to draw a line in the sand between, okay, before we were operating in a kind of suck it and see kind of way. Then we had an idea. We executed that through our product, our channels, our brand, whatever it was necessary to really make that a thing. If after that you don't see immediate traction, then you can actually pretty much immediately go back to the drawing board. You don't have, I don't really think you have to follow like, you know, you have to sort of try for a long period of time. You should be getting very, very strong signals. And yeah, going, as you say, you need the sensitivity to kind of pick up on them. And I guess that's a problem a lot of founders have, that they don't really have that. I couldn't give you a proportion, but I think more than half of founders, they don't really have that sensitivity because because this is necessary in a sense to become a founder. They have a sort of egoic attachment to their own vision. So then, which essentially makes you closed-minded. So what will happen is that, firstly, most businesses will fail, as we know. So their egoic attachment drove them into failure. So that's one box. The second box is their initial idea. It succeeded well enough up to a point. So it was at least half right. At which point you then naturally as the founder, you think, well, bloody hell, I'm a genius. I really know what I'm doing. But then you get attached to your idea. And then when you hit a wall, when you hit a plateau, when you sort of max out that idea, you don't have the ability to detach and shift the idea to take the next stage of growth. And then the final box is obviously a humble founder who recognizes sort of from day one that the whole thing is just an experiment and we're here to learn, we're not here to dictate. And then they are going to grow through to a certain size and then very naturally say, right, I think we've proven that there's something here. We've proven that we've got something of value. Now let's really figure out what that is and press on.
Okay. Love to know a little bit about great examples of great strategies from great companies.
Okay, so I'll tell you, I mean, it's it's very hard not to just give you the cliched examples, but they're cliches for a reason. So I think it's just better to embrace that.
Are you going to tell me about Ryanair and Southwest Airlines?
I could do. Would you like to hear about those ones?
No, I've heard those ones over and over again. Give me different ones. I love that people always do airlines, though. They come up often.
Yeah, I mean, Southwest is, I think Michael Porter, or one of the original strategy dons, he said, if there was a Nobel Prize for strategy, Southwest Airlines would have won it. So it is definitely the most...
Give it in a nutshell now, because we've teed it up and everyone's going to be like, what is
tell me that one.
Just do it quickly and just put me out my misery.
All right, so long story short, whole airline industry is geared around servicing business travelers, most lucrative travelers. So therefore, they create their whole businesses and value chains
and their planes
and everything to please and serve business travelers. Fine. But of course, like whenever all of the market is all clustering in on trying to serve the same function, that results in commodification. And then they have to compete on price and then profits crash. Going back to the original definition, that is a case of we're selling something people want, business travel, but they can get it from lots of places. It doesn't work. That's the situation most businesses find themselves in, a competitive dynamic. Southwest then comes along and says, well, what if we were to just actually, you know what, we're going to sack off business travelers altogether. They can have them. We are going to just give up completely on the most lucrative part of the market.
And just serve plebs like us.
And just serve the plebs. And then you follow that through to, okay, well, what does that mean for our planes? What does that mean for how many people we can get on a plane? What does that mean for our routes? You know, flying in and out of shitty airports. Like almost every single bit of their sort of structure then changes and becomes unique and so then they start to build huge differentiation. And ultimately, Southwest and American Airlines are fundamentally, at least for a period of time, not competing with each other. American Airlines is screwed and goes bankrupt because it's competing with everyone else. Southwest Airlines over here, sitting pretty, the only ones doing what they're doing. Boom, off they go, far and away the most successful airline. So yes, that is the classic one because it's got all of the ingredients. Let me see, another one which I would really highlight. Again, it's a very, very famous one, but I think it's worth pointing out because it's a great example of the amateur nature of the discipline, is Tesla's initial strategy that built the electric car market. So in a nutshell, obviously electric cars existed before Tesla. The focus of that market, you can see what they were thinking was, okay, well, these are going to be very economical, little tiny city runarounds like the G-Wiz and stuff like that. And it's all going to be focused on the environment and economy. So what basically, I mean, I know there was few more people involved in Tesla, but essentially what Elon Musk sort of recognized is, well, look, this is kind of bollocks to give an economy-based offer of a product which is crazily expensive. Electric cars they still are expensive, and they were even more expensive back then. So he was like, they got this all backwards. What you need to do is not try and make an economical car with electric technology. You need to make the most expensive, desirable, sexy car possible, because that way you align the prices, and also basically you sell to people who want it for posing purposes as opposed to these completely false economic purposes.
And you can build up a business case.
and you can build up a business case. And then, so they started with the Roadster, a sort of supercar product. Then they dropped to a sort of performance luxury car, the Model S. And so they did the opposite of what other companies do. Instead of starting with a crappy car and working up to a premium car, they started at the top and worked their way down. And they worked their way down as the hype and interest in the market grew. So the Roadster built the demand for the Model S, which built the demand for the Model 3 or whatever it was. And so on and on it goes. And one of the reasons this is so amazing, you should really check this out. There's a blog post from 2006, which Elon Musk wrote, which is called Tesla's Secret Master Plan, brackets, just between you and me. And basically it's just a blog post that just says what I said there. And he bashed that out. And there's no substantiation particularly to it because it doesn't really need substantiating. It's, like I say, it's no data here. This is just a commonsensical observation that other people just hadn't happened to have made before. And once again, it's about that's all it took. And then that not only built Tesla, but of course the entire category. And, but it's just 200-word paragraph really. And that is the substance of it. I think one thing that I want to pick out from both of those examples, and any example, we can rattle through more, is that the crux of all of these things, and I think this is the place where this is why the quality of strategy is generally so poor, is that they miss this central crux, which is that every strategy worth its salt boils down to finding a point of disagreement with the category you're in. So, you have to basically, so Tesla are like, we make electric cars, but the thing that the whole electric car category is getting wrong is X, so we're going to do Y. We're airline, that's wrong, we're going to do Y. You have to find this contrarian position within the category. And when you observe most businesses out there, this is the opposite of what they do. Most businesses, they kind of fight with their competitors over who can agree more. So it's like, you care about the environment? Well, we really care about the environment. You think customer service is important? We really think customer service is important. And that sort of furious agreeing and trying to one-up each other, that is what creates clustering, commodification, low profits, and everything that we're trying to avoid.
And obviously it's easy to say, Elon Musk just bangs up a essay and gets strategy right in a few hundred words. But obviously what goes behind that quick strategy is decades of experience.
Yeah, and so that's why it's when you talk about a 6-minute strategy, it's like the classic, Picasso, it took me my whole life kind of thing. That's always going to be the case. I think it should be taken as read that whatever your context you're in, whatever market you're in, when you start strategizing, it should be taken as read that you already have a lot of knowledge in your head. Like, in my book, for example, I'm not sure I even mention in passing things like research and stuff like that, because I'm just taking it as read that, look, if you're actually venturing to do a strategy.
You've bought a book on strategy. You bloody hope that you might know that research is part of it.
But yeah, it's not a book on how to conduct consumer research.
Yeah.
Should you do consumer research in order to build up your knowledge base? Clearly, I'm never, ever going to dispute that. But the research is not the strategic process any more than when you were going to school, you were building into the strategic process. Your whole bloody life is building into the strategic process. But there comes a point when you're like, based on my accumulated knowledge, off we go.
I'm going to level with you. I'm not the best manager in the world. I'm a decent coach, but management is my co-founder's thing, not mine. And thank God for that, because developing your team is one of the single most high leverage things you can do as a leader, which is why I'm really happy we're working with Personio. They're the all-in-one HR platform you need to handle everything, from hiring to onboarding, handling absences to managing compensation. Their features touch every point of the employee lifecycle, from onboarding right through to exit interviews. And because they automate so much of the boring but necessary HR admin, you and your managers can focus on getting the best out of your people. So, if you're leading a growing business and want to spend less time on HR admin, then book a demo at personio.com/secret leaders. That's personio.com/secret leaders. There's a link in the show notes.
One of the most appreciated things in, I think, the world is explaining complex things in a more simple manner, right? And that's actually very hard to do. Richard Feynman, one of the world's great physicists, loved by everyone for the simple idea of explain it like I'm 5. So I think one of the things you do really well is explain complex strategies like I'm five. And some of the great businesses, likewise, have great strategies that are made very simple. Can you give us some examples of those?
Yeah. So another one that I like, because it's another good example of, again, the sort of the contrarian ethos that's necessary, is the strategy behind the Nintendo Switch. So
I've got one. I've got one inside in the other room, based ironically off one of your posts on Nintendo Switch.
Oh, well, that's too bad, because I was about to put you on the spot, because one of the
I can pretend I don't.
one of the things that
But I also read I listened to like 3 podcasts on Nintendo and got really into.
well, then you're actually going to be ahead of me then, because I'm just giving a pastiche.
I got really into it, and then I bought the Switch because I was like, this is just too genius. And anyway, sorry.
So it's like this is the best way. The only way that you can judge truly whether you have executed a strategy is, can an external observer, just a punter or whatever, can they basically parrot your strategy back at you simply by observing your business without ever having read any strategy documents or whatever? And again, the reason why we always bang on about Red Bull and Nike and Apple and all of this is because these are simply businesses that wear their strategy on their sleeve, and anyone can look at them and say, I see what they're doing. Isn't that clever? That's why we all like to talk about them. So again, I would have said to you, maybe you can just like riff for me on what you think the strategy was, but obviously you know. But again, in a nutshell, we look back, it's a question of, okay, dominant players in the market, Xbox and PlayStation, what is the value that they are trying to deliver to customers? Essentially, it's power and like who can build the faster, better graphics, whatever machine. And so they're involved in that dogfight. Nintendo, let's say for sake of argument, well, it would have been a strategically bad idea to join that dogfight. Maybe they actually don't have the capabilities to do it anyway. I don't know. So then Nintendo asked a very powerful question, which actually I would recommend any business ask. And they would say, okay, we're a bit weak at this one metric, power. What if we were to actually lean into that? What if instead of being sort of weak by accident, we actually were weak on purpose? What if we maybe even were even more weak? What if we give up on this value altogether? So obviously, in the case of the Switch, what that resulted in was the ability to make a console that was much smaller than other consoles, which then became the first ever portable, proper console. I mean, obviously you had Game Boys and stuff like that, but a proper grown-up TV console. And of course, it had a big effect on the type of games that they were able to develop and the parts of the market they targeted. So it wasn't simply about portability, but that was the most obvious element of it. And so by actually, again, undermining and contradicting the core value of the market, they were then able to unlock a different path, which then, ironically, even though they were contradicting what we would consider the core value of the market, they then, at least for a time, if not still today, became the number one console in the world. So it's actually very similar to Southwest in that respect. It starts off as a quote unquote niche market, which then, what do you know? Now we're actually earning way more money than the people in the center of the market. And there's another.
But just on that, there was one other thing that they tapped into, which was just audience insight. You're talking about what's our weakness, what's our strength, which is a great way to define the strategy. The other thing is who plays Xbox and PlayStation? All the bros. All the bros, all the gamers, everywhere in the world. And so you've got this really captive audience of, say, 10-year-olds to 25-year-olds or maybe 30-year-olds. Great. Who's everyone else in the world?
Yeah.
And it's amazing just by saying, well, who's everyone else in the world? Okay, well, 0 up to 10, 30 plus. And like, you know what? Like my wife and I have a 2-year-old who bought a Switch at Christmas. She bought me a Switch. And we love it. We've been playing. And like, we would just not play PlayStation together. We wouldn't play an Xbox together. We've been playing Switch. Haven't had a games console for 6 or 7 years personally. It's fascinating. Like, they're not really marketing to me, but by the nature of creating something completely new, lo-fi, really easy to just turn on and have a game and just play and be done with it in 10 minutes as well, totally tap into a completely surprise market. I would never think of myself as someone bothering to buy a console or anything like that. And we both are, by the very nature, and this is what happens with strategies like that, right? You find these unusual other pockets. You're not really targeting people like me and my wife. You're targeting people, maybe slightly older kids. So it's a family game. But we are like, well, maybe it will be a family game in the future, so we'll start now. You just sort of start to get these surprise pockets of customers.
So it's like you see like there are two ways of entering the same strategy there. The power way, the leaning into a weakness way, which then you latterly can ask the question, and who would this serve well? And then you can open up, oh, well, little kids, families, basically gamers that are not only underserved, but also probably aren't so obsessed with this ultimate fidelity of the graphics, etc. Or you could also come at it from the other way. You could start with the audience and then latterly figure out that you need less power, etc., etc. So you can see how it's this really non-linear process. And what really matters is however you enter the secret, however you uncover it, what really matters is then you need to pull the thread all the way to look at all of the possible implications for this. So, just using that analogy, it wasn't enough for them to say, hypothetically, console's less powerful, therefore it's portable. Other than that, we're a general console. No, you then need to actually keep on asking, okay, what is the implications of this strategy for audience? All that stuff you just said. What is the implication for the type of games? Everything you just said. There's also the point which you touched on about instead of it being focused on online gaming, it's in-room multiplayer, right? So many different threads to be pulled on. And essentially, every time you find a new practical implication of the strategy to execute, every single one of those things you find, you edge further and further and further away from the market norms, and you take deeper and deeper ownership of your kind of walled garden. And I think that's the kind of like the ultimate win is that creation of a walled garden, as I would call it, because that's where super high profits are made. So obviously a lot of businesses, they're very focused on market share, but market share is a super unstrategic notion. I mean, don't get me wrong, I feel like Pampers or something like that, then it makes a lot of sense when you're already the core of the market. But most businesses aren't that. You should instead be not thinking about how big is my market share. You should be thinking about how deep and profitable is the part of the market that I currently hold. So the Switch does that. And the fact that there's most gamers in the round won't consider a Switch.
Yeah, they would look at that as like, that's pathetic.
Yeah.
Which is exactly a perfect example of a good strategy, right? You want haters.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You got to have haters. And actually, and that reminds me, I'm probably completely butchering the specifics of this. I just think it's a funny one that's related to the Switch. I don't know that much about it. But on the subject of, sort of embracing a weakness and cutting against category norms, people sort of think that there's a limit to how much you can do that and how sacred some norms are to certain categories. But there's this baseball team called the Savannah Bananas. They're a minor league baseball team. And they did a very similar thing, but where the norm that they cut against, the thing that they decided to undervalue because they were already crap at it anyway, was actually being good at baseball. And so you think to yourself, how is it possible that a sports team can sacrifice actually being able to play their sport? So they basically withdrew resources from wage bills, coaching, I don't know, whatever, all the stuff that goes into performing on the field. And they piled all of those resources into fan experience. So they're like, we're going to be the worst baseball team, but we're going to be the most enjoyable baseball team to come and watch. And again, you can sort of imagine how this worked out for them. Like, given that ultimately it's still trying to make a profit, of course they become the most sort of like profitable baseball team. And ironically, they end up earning so much money that, what do you know, they actually can plow money back into the sporting side after all. So all I would say is, if a sports team can question the value of being good at sports, you can question the value of some things that at the moment you think are completely sacred.
Is this like actually in itself a really great insight into how not to create what's become known as a bland?
It's a difficult one because, I mean, I could talk a long time about blands and I really hate blands. But what I will say is that the blanding phenomenon is a cross-category phenomenon. So you probably could argue that every single category can sustain one bland. a bland toothbrush and a bland suitcase are not technically competing with each other. In fact, they are becoming part of the sort of the bland arsenal of a person who really likes blands. So the fact that it sort of proliferated, I don't think was necessarily strategically dumb. I mean, for various reasons, most of those companies, I think, pretty much failed. And the bland world is the home of all of the kind of car crash case studies like Casper and WeWork, and they're all blands, which I haven't actually really thought about why that is, but that's an interesting question, isn't it? But yeah, I think that you need to think about it obviously on a contextual basis. So yeah, if there was no bland in your category, I could see a case for going for it.
Yeah, for becoming the worst baseball team in your category, basically, just to go completely sag. Okay, because I'm enjoying them, one more example of great strategy.
One more example of great strategy. In terms of UK brands,
Yeah.
I often get asked specifically about FMCG brands. There are only two brands in the UK supermarket that I really look at and I say, respect, that is good. Grenade and Lily's Kitchen, pet food.
On Grenade, we had the founder here on Secret Leaders many years ago, and he took me through their strategy, and which you're hopefully now about to share. I was blown away by how genius it was.
Wow. Okay. So on the subject of sort of post-rationalizing the strategy from an observer's perspective.
Yeah. I hope you're about to say you hate it and think it's terrible, so we can argue about it, but go on.
No, I wish I could. I wish I could. But let's cross-reference notes, because I haven't actually seen an in-depth explanation from the founder of how they did it. So I'm just going to give you my observation of what's happening. Let's see how much it overlaps.
Great. Okay, you share that, and I'll do a reminder for our listeners on what he explained it as. Go.
Yeah.
Are you building a SaaS or venture-backed business? Or are you just trying to grow internationally? Well, if potential customers or investors haven't already asked you about ISO 27001, SOC 2, or GDPR compliance, they probably will soon. Achieving compliance can unlock major growth for your company, but the process is often time-intensive and costly. This is where our partner, Vanta, can help. Vanta automates up to 90% of compliance work, getting you audit ready in weeks instead of months and saving you significant costs. Plus, Vanta scales with your business, helping you successfully enter new markets, land bigger deals, and earn customers' trust. As a special offer, Secret Leaders listeners get 20% off Vanta when they go to vanta.com/secretleaders. That's VANT.com/secretleaders for 20% off. There's a link in the description.
So with Grenade, obviously what essentially by and by they've done is that protein bars existed before, but they have managed to eat into the regular confectionery category with a protein bar, and in doing so completely destroy all notions of what is acceptable price and stuff like that in the kind of confectionery part of the supermarket. So who's ever going to pay £3 for a chocolate bar? Well, the answer is people going in via Grenade. But so that's kind of like the interesting commercial element. But the thing I particularly think is interesting about it as a case study, and it isn't really their whole strategy, but it's the bit that I always come back to, is that Grenade is bought, as I understand it, by 50% women. This, despite ostensibly it looking like a product that's targeted at 14-year-old boys. I think there's a really powerful lesson in there, because so many brands, what they try and do is they have an idea of who the target market is, and then they try to be very sort of representative of that target market. They try to reflect that person back at them. So most businesses, they try and say, we get you. We are for a person like you.
But they forget that every 50-year-old woman wants to be a 14-year-old boy with a switch.
Precisely that, right? It's like people don't buy what they are. People buy what they wish they were, or even taking it one step further, They just buy something that's coherent. And the beauty of Grenade, because it is fundamentally so tacky, let's face it, is that they took decisions which every other bloody brand in the supermarket, the founders are too, frankly, snobbish to take. No one wants to target like 14-year-old, like chavvy kids who are into kind of like weapons and getting hench and all the rest of it, because it's a sort of low status part of the market. And tanks and this, they love their tanks. So already there's this huge open space for that type of brand. And then when you build that type of brand, the thing that you create is so distinctive and so clear and has so much charisma that the whole notion of targeting goes out of the window, because basically people from all walks of life, they understand what that thing is. And they are smart enough to put 2 and 2 together and pick it off the shelf. And nobody out there is saying, you know, oh, well, I don't like grenades, so therefore I'm not going to buy this. But this, I think, is how like the whole industry seems to operate, because of this obsession with relevance, as they would call it. And so they blow all of that apart. And I think that, and ultimately, the bottom line is, I think that, you know, it's through that hyper distinctiveness and clarity that they've managed to cut through.
There is a part of the strategy that you've missed. And I actually think it's the most interesting part, although everything you said is bang on. It's that they worked out that the majority of confectionery bars actually are bought at petrol stations, and they did some customer development with people who own the petrol stations and work at the tills, and basically all the Mars bars and everything were sold for £1. The margins are whatever they are. They say that the petrol station gets 30p or 40p max, obviously less, but let's call it 30p of the pound. So they were like, okay. And obviously in retail spaces, front of mind, you know, right by the till, that's the most important real estate. So they're like, okay, well, we will charge £3. They'll be really popular. You'll get £1.50. You'd have to sell 5 Mars bars or whatever to just sell one of these. How does that sound? And they just completely blew the pricing of everything else. Literally every other confectionery bar that was sold at every single petrol station didn't come close to selling just a handful of grenade bars. They made it so incentivized. And I love that because of the whole, you know, I think it's Charlie Munger who says, show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. Right? In that example, they worked out, like, what do people really care about? They care about the incentive. They're businesses at the end of the day. They want to make money. And so he just completely upended the entire confectionery category's pricing strategy.
Out of curiosity, did obviously by and by the same pattern played out in grocery, but presumably early on that they couldn't make that argument fly in grocery. Yeah. What was the reason that in grocery it was a harder slog, or did they not get into that?
No, I think it's more that, you know, to get into a Sainsbury's and a Tesco and all of that.
A bit more centralised, a bit more difficult. In that
totally.
respect.
So they can still charge more, but the margins aren't going to be as exciting anyway, because as in they will be to Tesco and Sainsbury's, but I think you have to prove the business case en masse, right? And actually having tens of thousands of petrol stations and showing that you're the number one and upended all the others, you're going to get Tesco's listening to you.
That makes a lot of sense about actually what the patterns that you see in petrol stations in general. They have a very interesting selection of products on offer compared to a supermarket. And so I suppose that's actually the more general rule being played out. I mean, classic example like jerky. Petrol stations love jerky. Supermarkets don't really like jerky. It's also quite an expensive product that sort of is fitting into that same world. So yeah, no, I hadn't considered that. I'll add that to my
add that to your list.
To my list, yeah.
Do you know 4-hour energy strategy?
No.
This is the best strategy of all time.
4-hour energy.
This is the best strategy of all time.
Are those little shots?
Yes.
No, I don't know anything about it.
Okay, so very simply, founder's a billionaire, just for, and the only product they make is 4-hour energy. And insight was everything in America was Monster and Red Bull, but predominantly Monster actually. And the core customer is a truck driver who's doing long night shifts over multiple hours. And the most irritating thing that he learned, because he was a truck driver, is you drink those to stay up and then you need to piss all the time. And so that's very annoying. And so he made 4-hour energy, called it what it is, tiny little bottle, same amount of caffeine, energy, sugar, etc. as you get in a Monster. No need to wee. $1 billion company.
That is Excellent.
Right?
That
Add that
is
to your list.
all of the principles
All of
coming
them.
together into. You can't get more.
And he charged a lot for it.
than that.
He didn't charge
Yeah.
any less than a Monster.
Wow. And I've often thought, why the hell would someone buy that thing? And now it makes perfect sense.
Know your customer.
Yeah.
Can you win without a successful strategy? Are there any examples of great startups, great businesses, shit strategy?
Yeah. I mean, basically, 99% of successful businesses are examples of successful businesses without strategies, because 99% of businesses, these type of sort of charismatic, snappy, clever concepts that we've been discussing, your average business, including your average very successful business, doesn't have one of these in its locker, right? So there is a very simple way to win without a strategy, which everyone understands and everyone is doing, and it's totally fine and legitimate, which is simply effort. Now, effort manifests in a lot of ways. Effort is obviously, yes, working hard. Effort is spending lots of money. Money is just a proxy for effort. Effort is cutting costs. Effort is trying to do amazing marketing. Can we do more persuasive ads than our competitor? Effort is adding some features and benefits. Effort is, there's everything in that sort of tactical realm. If you push and push and push, then you can keep on sort of like grabbing tiny little slivers of competitive advantage. And this is the game that most businesses are doing. And ultimately, if you are richer and or try harder and or are smarter than your competitors, then in this sort of scrabble, you are going to make it through. And that is kind of what defines success for most businesses. Now, in that scenario, the one thing that you're always going to be held back on, unless you sort of like sometimes, I don't know, you could be a pharma business that gets a patent on Viagra or something. So there are exceptions like that. But generally, the one thing that you're going to be held back on is that you're never going to be outlandishly profitable. There's this idea, which I think is really, really spot on, which is to say that the only way that you really judge the presence of a strategy or not is how profitable is the business compared to the average in its category. So let's say the average profit margin, I don't know, is like 15% in your category. So that means that the average business, regardless of its size in that category, is making 15%. But then if there's a super strategic business, even if it's much smaller, it might be making 40%.
Well, so interestingly, I think I read recently that the average profit margin in the Fortune 500 is 45%, which is very high.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Very high, but you're talking about the top 500 companies in the world. So in theory, that actually sort of stands to reason.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think that, I don't know what the kind of like the makeup of that top 500 is, but let's just say for sake of argument that like half of them were banks. And let's just say that, it just so happens that the profit margin of banks is 45%. So there you go. So like it could be that even if they are sort of like very, very unstrategic. Also, it's worth pointing out that market leaders, big legacy brands, they are playing a different game. They do not need to do the stuff that we are talking about. You take a business like Pampers, like we were talking about before. A market leader has the ability, because they've been around for 60 years and they've got incredible resources, incredible name recognition, distribution, and of course, amazing R&D. They can hold on to the core of the category. So like the core of nappies is being dry or something like that, right? There's nothing clever about that. That's just the basic thing people want. Pampers compile all of their considerable might into owning that core. And then the other brands, they have to sort of navigate around it.
Yeah, they're the ones who have to define a strategy.
They're the ones who have to kind of define a strategy. Pampers' strategy is to basically just bully their way into keeping their position. And that's why you got to be super careful if you are a sort of challenger brand, upcoming brand, startup, whatever. Like I have a sort of rule of thumb where if the brand is over 40 years old, ignore it. Don't learn from it, because they are playing by a completely different rule book than what you are playing by. So yeah, I think those are basically the two sort of unstrategic options. Either number one, be lucky enough, powerful enough to be a market leader and just who's came up in a different era, or number two, just just be really tactical, just be an amazing tactical business. And everything that most businesses are thinking, focusing their energies on, reading books about, doing trainings about, investing their money on, all of it falls into the bucket of trying to be an incredible tactical operator.
And that's really how you win the dogfight, right? That's if you don't have a good strategy.
Yeah. And, and I don't think you're never going to win the dogfight. I think by definition, a dogfight is not won, but you can grow and you can earn money and you can build brand reputation. And I think that's also where advertising comes in really helpful for those sort of businesses, because advertising and building brand recognition and all that kind of thing, it's a sort of way to get competitive advantage when you don't really have any. So we may not really have anything particularly interesting to say about our business, but if we do good enough advertising, then at least people will like us and remember us. And that's already pretty good.
What do you think of challenger brand strategy? Or do you have any good examples? Or do you think it's all bollocks?
No, I kind of think that isn't... I'm gonna just checking if I even agree with myself here.
Yeah.
I'm gonna kind of say, aren't all strategies by definition challenger brand strategies? In that,
not Pampers.
No. But all
everything
non-market.
but Pampers.
Because everybody is pivoting around the market leader.
Yeah.
So unless you are Pampers, like even Huggies. Is Huggies a challenger brand? It is, isn't it? So I suppose I don't really draw any differentiation. I think that I think that it's been a long time since I read about challenger brands, so I'm struggling to sort of think of any sort of like specifics beyond the kind of stuff that we've talked about. But I actually do think that I think it's actually a really good notion, because the concept of challenger, even though now it's been said so often that it becomes like wallpaper and no one remembers what it means. And actually it's worse than that, because what you actually get is a lot of people who look at brands like Ben & Jerry's or Patagonia and they think, oh, they're challenger brands. That's what a challenger brand looks like. Therefore, I should be like that. Missing the obvious point that no, they're former challenger brands. Now they're the status quo. By definition, a challenger to Ben & Jerry's is a business that is against Ben & Jerry's. Most challenger brands, they sort of miss that and they just sort of they try and fight the status quo with the status quo. But that's kind of like an obvious mistake. But in general, yeah, I like the vernacular because it should remind people that your job is to cut against the core of the category. And that is the fundamental thing, which no matter how often you say it, people just forget about time and time again. Or even worse, what I really hate, and this actually is a kind of challenger brand behavior, is when you get people who, they sort of create a straw man to attack. So this is particularly true with, let's say, purposeful, social good, eco-friendly brands, where they'll say something like, like we are the brand in our category that really cares about the environment, let's say. They say it as if the market leaders were still like 1940s style robber barons, like gleefully burning down rainforests and stuff. Every bloody business on the planet is,
moving in that direction.
They're moving in that direction. So it's a completely low leverage thing to do. I mean, Liquid Death actually is
Liquid Death, yes.
Liquid Death is a genuine challenger brand who, I'm being a little bit reductive and glib here, but basically they're a challenger brand because they've gone against all of that purposeful stuff. Yeah. So that's what a real challenger looks like in 2023. So, it's a new cycle. It's a new cycle of what is challenger.
Okay, if you were going to start a startup tomorrow, how would you create a strategy for it? What would you do?
So there's one technique that I think is quite cool, which it's a good game to play for an established business just to break your thought patterns, but it won't necessarily yield a good idea. But it's more interesting, I think, with an early stage business, which is just this sort of thing that I made up, but actually kind of like I think it works quite well, called value mixing. So essentially, first step is, okay, what's the category that we're operating in? Granted, this doesn't work for sort of very new concepts that don't have a root category, but let's just sort of park them. Let's say that you're existing in a established category. So first thing you're like, okay, well, what are the norms of this category? I'm going to look on the website of every single one of my top 5 biggest competitors, top 5 brands in the category. And I'm going to see, what are they offering? What matters to them? What are they putting out there? They've done a huge amount of research on the consumer and all that kind of thing. So I don't have to do it, because I can just look at, the Unilever brand has spent millions. Why do I need to go and do that? They've done it for me. I can figure out what is going on here. So then you lay out, okay, that's the territory, that's the shape of the category, right? Okay, that's what I'm not going to do. Doesn't mean that I'm going to necessarily go against all those things, but like, I'm not going to try and get leverage by playing them at their own game. Next, you can find a handful of completely random, unrelated categories, nothing to do with your category, and you can play exactly the same game. So I don't know. So let's say I'll give you a real example, because this is actually a classic challenger brand example, which was Method, the cleaning products. That's a real, that's a bit like Southwest. It's a textbook one where they looked, so the legend goes, in the category of olive oil for their inspiration. So yes, let's say you're a cleaning product, and then you look at olive oil and you say, okay, let's look at all the olive oil brands. We're going okay, well, what matters in olive oil? So there's, making this up, so there's sort of artisan nature of the product. Provenance matters hugely in olive oil. Sort of shelf appeal, beauty. They're very beautiful products as supermarket products goes, and, a handful of other things. So then you can just take all of these completely random, untethered sort of value offerings from other categories, and then just do mix and match. Just see what would that look like in my category? Is there something there? Literally, in the case of Method, they obviously took the sort of shelf appeal of olive oil, meant to be sort of placed. People always place their olive oil in line of sight in their kitchen. It doesn't go in the cupboard for whatever reason. It's always out of the cupboard.
Yeah,
so they're kind of
very seen. Yeah.
Yeah.
do that now you mention it. Yeah.
It's weird. I don't know why, but I guess because it looks nice. So they were kind of hypothetically, could you create a cleaning product that has the same dynamic? And that's what they did. And then they create this beast, which, it's not very clever to just, nicely designed floor cleaner. But it was such a pattern break with the thinking of the category up to that point that it's, there's this thing that we could never have conceptualized, such a radical thing. And so for a while, Method, that was quite an easy thing to copy, but for a while, Method had serious leverage with that idea. But it's as simple as just okay, I'm going to take something that matters over here, put it in there. Another brand I absolutely love, one of the all-time greats for me, is Lush. So it's a very similar thing. Lush, they brought this concept of freshness into cosmetics. I don't know if they were the first to do it. But they were certainly the first to really sort of make it work and own it. Where did freshness come from? It came from fresh fruit and veg. What does a Lush store look like when you walk into it? It looks like a fruit and veg stand. So they very brutally and basically were okay, we are going to land this slightly new, quirky idea by just playing on pre-existing conceptions that people had. And then they're oh, yes, I suppose it would be nice if my moisturizer was fresh, which something that I didn't really care about before. So it's the same process. So I think that's just a cool game to play. To whether or not you come up with a great idea is sort of by the by. At least what you do is you get out of your own head and you stop thinking on rails, which is what being a human is what you're going to be doing before that point. And actually, it reminds me of a much more stupid example, stupid principle, but one that I think is super underrated, which is basically, if in doubt, just spend 3 times more on branding than anyone else in your category. If you're already in
that is stupid. You're right. And I'm laughing because I think that's what we did.
If you're already exactly,
yeah.
If you're already in a beautiful category, that doesn't work. But most, you could be watching this and you could be I don't know, plumbing supplies or insurance broker or something like that. Most categories are ugly, basically, and they're sort of they're under designed. And this is completely unstrategic, but I really think it's just a very easy, brainless thing to do. If you put more effort into that, 3 times more effort into that than anyone else in your category, at the very least, you are going to look like the premium, I kind of want that option, which in the absence of true strategic leverage, that's pretty good. So I really think that's just a neat tip. That's what I did.
Yeah. So you talked a lot about strategy, simple, hard, etc. But how do you make sure it's differentiated enough so that not everyone else thinks, God, that's genius, we'll do that too?
So there's a little sort of model that you can remember very easily. Okay, better equals shit strategy. Different equals okay strategy. Whereas contrarian equals great strategy. Now, better, as we sort of touched on before, better is a synonym for the same. That's where everyone's competing and everyone's clustering together. And it doesn't matter if you are better or aren't better objectively than your competitors. No one cares because the market only reads difference. It doesn't read degrees in kind. So then we move on to different. Now, different is obviously good, but the problem is you have a good idea and then other people are like, oh, that's a good idea and we'll copy it too. So actually method was really good, but in a sense it was like quite an undefensible strategy. And so, they didn't really hold on to that for a long time because there wasn't really a reason why a lot of other brands couldn't just, we could actually make nice packaging. So don't get me wrong, big respect to anyone who manages different because most people don't even manage that, but it's vulnerable. The reason that the contrarian, like what we talked about with Southwest and Nintendo and all that type of thing, is so good is because explicitly what you do is you undermine something which your competitors really rely on. So you are offering a value which is inherently incompatible with the value that they're offering. So when they see, that's a good idea, they're like, well, if we do that, then we're going to cut ourselves off at the knees. So, if American Airlines, of course, eventually they did, but for a long time, for American Airlines to compete with Southwest, they would have to screw over their business travelers, i.e. their complete sort of profit base. So they're not going to do that. How is PlayStation? I mean, yes, they could launch a whole new console, which is going to be not manageable. How is PlayStation realistically going to compete with the Switch? They can't, and so they just don't bother. So you just want to be in a situation where essentially the other brands kind of just don't bother with competing with you. It's just too much effort. They're like, okay, fine, yeah, let them do their little thing. That's fine. That's the kind of reaction you want. And this doesn't really happen in real life, obviously, but you can imagine this idea of what I call a perfect market. A perfect market would be a market that is flawlessly segmented with different brands doing different jobs with zero overlap. So this is stupid, but if the only car brands that existed in the world were Jeep, Skoda, Ferrari, and Rolls-Royce or something, then the car market would essentially be a perfect market because it would be sort of balanced and it would be uncompetitive and all of those brands would be hyper profitable. Now, of course, that isn't the case and you're never going to do that with your whole category, but you can at least do it for yourself. You can at least create that walled garden for yourself where copying you is just too difficult, too painful, too self-destructive. And like I say, the secret sauce to that is you've got to find the point of disagreement.
There's a very niche, not interesting to either of us, but example of a YouTuber doing this at the moment. So the fastest growing YouTuber in the world is this guy called Sam Sulek, who everyone's talking about because he, Mr. Beast is doing these big production videos. It's all about thumbnail and all this stuff. And then there's this guy who's just like a meathead, like a 20-year-old meathead. He's just going to the gym and he's just filming his things. No editing, just talking to the camera, just sticks it down. Video might be an hour, might be 2 hours. It's just him working out. It's just him picking it up, talking, putting it down, etc. He's just filming. He's doing none of the tricks, no thumbnails, nothing. Is just uploading. And he's gone from like 0 to X millions by doing the exact opposite of what anyone who tells you how to grow on YouTube should do. He's doing the exact opposite and he is becoming like a fan favorite. Is a great example. Whether it's purposeful or not, it's contrarian.
Yeah, and even more than that, it's an example as well of the most powerful thing. This is, when people tell you to like just be yourself, like strategically, this is actually really good advice because people think too much about the thing that they are, like, what would be a cool thing to do, a cool thing to be. They don't think enough about how much they are the thing that they choose to become. So the ultimate thing and the grenade is a fantastic example of this, the ultimate thing that's really going to give you power, assuming that your idea isn't just completely stupid, is being so fully and completely and coherently what you are that you're basically very understandable and passable. So, you say like Johnny Knoxville and Mother Teresa are both very charismatic people. But the thing that makes them charismatic is not the content of their characters, because they're very different. The content of the character is a complete red herring. What matters is that they are both very much
Them.
a thing. Yeah, them, right? And this applies to businesses too. Like, you pick your lane. I don't know, is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Who cares?
Commit.
What matters is the degree of commitment. And actually, you can look at a lot of really great brands. Patagonia is an example of this. Patagonia, I would suggest, is not a strategically differentiated brand. But because there are loads of other brands similar to them that kind of have the same sort of ethos and talk a similar game. What Patagonia is that they are 10 times more that thing that they are than anyone else is. So even though they actually don't have a clever strategy, it doesn't bloody matter, because they look like they own that. And actually that is, if you're in doubt, like, I would almost say, like, you know what, if you can commit and execute sufficiently, you can almost kind of phone in the strategy.
Other than the beard, the shirt, the hair,
Crucial.
what are the other common traits of great strategists?
Number one is an utter inability to handle and process detail.
I might be a great strategist.
I think you might be.
Oh, Jesus.
We have this idea that, like, you have to be smart to do strategy. The problem is that most people's conception of what is smart is essentially someone who's very good at processing information. So a scientist or something like that. That is actually anti-strategic, because the whole process of strategy is about zooming out and looking at the big picture, as opposed to zooming in and looking at the detail. Now, both of these are very useful skills. They're just not the same skills. Now, if you are very comfortable with detail, then you will naturally burrow. And you can't burrow. You've got to sort of soar. And the beauty of being a person who gets a bit like, oh, you're telling me too much, is that person will naturally then say, just give me the gist, right? The second that you say, just give me the gist, bam, you're in strategy land, right? Because you're just sort of like, or like, maybe you can just about handle reading a really dense 10-page document, and you're going through it and you're hating it. But through that process of hating it, you're like, all right, okay. Yeah, basically what this is saying is X. That reduction, which is going to happen quite naturally for a person who is sort of like trying to escape the detail, that immediately puts you into a sort of like a strategic frame. And it's just about connecting the dots. It's sort of like natural zoom out process. So, like, bottom line is, anyone who has that natural zoom out aptitude is going to be able to start to see things, quote unquote, strategically. Don't get me wrong. A person who's really good with detail could do that too in principle, but they would have to consciously do it rather than automatically doing it. The other thing I guess I would say is just being comfortable and confident in just backing yourself and taking a punt, which also I think slightly
ticks off every entrepreneur. Then
It does. I mean, it should. It definitely should do. It's like, and it's an extension of the detail thing, because like anyone who wants proof before they make an act, by definition, there is no such thing as proof of a strategy until it's been done and then it either worked or it didn't. So you're not going to get on very well if you are humming and hawing over how can I really be sure this is the right thing to do, because you're never going to do it. And actually, you think about some of the strategies that we've talked about here. I know that it's benefit of hindsight, but I think that most of them are self-evidently such good ideas that, you don't know that they're going to work. But if someone told it to you on paper, you would be like, yeah, that's pretty clever, actually. Yeah, I could totally see how that would work. If you're comfortable with just getting over that threshold, that's enough. As soon as you tickle someone and they have a reaction of like, oh, you know what? I never thought about it that way. Like my reaction when you were explaining the grenade thing, or better yet, the 4-hour energy shot, right? Like, there's this visceral bodily reaction, like hearing a joke almost, where you're like, oh, shit, that's good. Like that is the closest you're going to get to proof of a strategy.
Any other common traits?
Yeah, just being able to talk bullshit a lot, I think, is actually pretty helpful as well. You know, you just got to, the communication, it's a motivation job. Strategy is 50% being right, maybe less, 20% being right. And it's 80% just getting people to say yes and hit the road and start doing stuff, right? You are better off conceptualizing of yourself as Tony Robbins than you are conceptualizing yourself as a professor, right? Because at the end of the day, I don't care what your idea is. If you can't get people excited and have them go, hell yeah, and start executing, which is when you're going to see the results, then it's all for nothing, isn't it?
So basically, great strategy is 20% insight and 80% leadership.
Definitely. And strategy and leadership are twinned. I mean, this isn't quite right, but it sounds good, so I'm going to say it, which is incidentally half of strategy. It's like strategy is just the content of the behavior of leadership, is how I see it. So, you know, if you're going to lead, you sort of need a bit of substance to lead with, I would suggest. Well, that's just strategy. So the two things are like that, right? Whereas management is a completely different skill set, which is antithetical to both leadership and strategy, in my view. And people tend to think of both leadership and strategy as subsets of management. And I would actually say they're enemies of management. These are just different games that have different roles at different parts of the business.
Okay, last question, if I may. So there's all these stories and folklore of entrepreneurship, etc. The brilliant idea that comes to you in the shower. And then there's sort of like the idea, if you go to get an MBA, I suppose, it's paying a lot of money to put a lot of effort in and research to get to the right strategy. How much of this is deliberate effort versus actually just a moment of insight and clarity?
So clearly the moments of insight and clarity do happen, and they do happen in the shower or in a sort of an unstructured space. I think that the TV show Succession that we've all watched, I think is a brilliant demonstration of real strategy in action. Because what happens there is you notice that the family and Logan Roy and whatever, they're constantly doing strategy, like on their yacht or like in the helicopter or whatever. And they're talking about stuff and they're thinking it through. And they're doing it outside of a formal framework. And then when they've made a decision, right, it's this, then off it goes to the bean counters and to be substantiated and sort of tied into something formal. But the process lives in the gaps. It lives in the pub or shooting the shit with your co-founder or whatever. That is where the thinking happens. It's got to be just chatting and friendly and humorous and exciting and all of that stuff. So you can do that loose behavior deliberately, and you should. So for example, like I would suggest that if you have co-founders and you aren't spending quote unquote leisure time together, that's a huge error, because that's where it's going to happen, right? And then once you've got that bit of inspiration, that initial sort of like leap has been done in those casual moments, you got to say, oh, that's something. Then you can pull that into a formal process, kick it around, test it. Is this actually bollocks? Blah, blah, blah. All of that rigor, you do that, but just you've got to first of all create the conditions for taking a leap.
Alex, thank you so much for joining us today on Secret Leaders. Where can people go follow you on LinkedIn, and what book should they be buying?
Well, on LinkedIn, they'll find me as Alex M.H. Smith. Very pretentious, but at least it makes Alex Smith searchable. And then, yeah, if you want to just know, speaking of knowing all of the principles, knowing everything you basically need to know, and then just riffing from there, well, that's the whole concept of the book. It's 138 pages. You read that and basically you'll be like, okay, it is this. And then after that, just go and play and hopefully it will fall together.
Wicked. Mate, thank you so much.
Pleasure.